into the start of the session, so I think I'm going to get going. Can I just check on the sound system? Is sound on and working? Great. And I think we are live, so welcome to our audience that is calling in from different parts of the world. We've got a great set of panelists with us here today, and what we're going to talk about is we're continuing this discussion on market systems resilience. And I realize some people may filter into the rumors, but I think we can get going because we've got the online audience. This is being recorded, and we can continue this discussion. So we're moving from kind of the first session, which was talking a little bit about the what, and this session is talking more about the how. So what we're doing here is we're getting much more practical into, how are we measuring some of these pieces? What are we actually talking about? And what I wanted to do is I wanted to start with our colleague, Luca Russo. Luca is with FAO, the Food and Agricultural organization. He's based in Rome in Italy. And Luca is now a senior advisor to the FAO and spent many years in the office as team lead in the Office of Emergency and Resilience. And he was also the senior strategic advisor for resilience at FAO. And so, Luca, we wanted to ask you, what are the contexts that are, especially when we look at fragile contexts? I think so much of our work nowadays is in fragile context. Yeah. What makes context fragile? What are the things that we're finding when we think about resilience in fragile contexts that are maybe different from when we used to think about general development programming?
Exactly. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Okay. Let me show something. It's something that I've just printed before coming here. That is my obsession. And I have a few of these. These are...
Caitlin, could you come hand these out, please?
Yeah, you can even distribute them. You see, these are in FAO, what I'm doing, I'm the person that gives the numbers every year about how many people are in need of humanitarian assistance. And you will see from that small handout that in the last 7 years, the number of people in need have more than doubled. Many reasons for this. You say it's conflict, you say it's climate, you say that it's economic downturn.
You can hold it closer.
It's economic downturn, but the fact is they have doubled. In the second page, if you look at the behind, you will see the level of assistance to the food sector that went into this country in the last 6-7 years. And you will see that more or less it has been stable. So double of people in need, same numbers for what concern the external development assistance. 2022 is a bit of an exception. We don't have yet the figures, but because of Ukraine, we have seen an incredible escalation of humanitarian assistance. But this is only 2022. It will go down again in 2023. So that is the issues. So in a situation like this, the policy, everyone says we cannot continue like this. We cannot continue like this. It's impossible, it's unsustainable, and the things will go worse. So, and then I will talk about the food maybe in the next question. So the point is, what do we do for this? Most of the people living in fragile contexts are living in rural areas, and they depends on, I use value chain, you can use also, but I use value chain, depend from value chain, which are unfortunately poor value chain. They are the rich value chain and the poor value chain. The rich value chain, I've heard today, I was really listening to Michael, you have Bania, you have all these things, but you have also value chain that have very little interest in the market. So there is very little investment in this value chain, and therefore the actors along this value chain are the ones that most probably are also in the list of the 258 million people. So what do we do to understand better what matters in the value chain that matters to the most vulnerable? So that is a bit the question that maybe we can come back on this.
I think that's good, and to leave us with a question that we will circle back to: what matters? How do we understand better what matters in poorer value chains. I wanted to recognize that part of what we're looking at here is, I think you ask a good question. What do we understand better? And also, how are people doing this? So I wanted to turn to an example that's coming out of IDE Mozambique. Lena Hanau is working with IDE, the Monitoring, Evaluation and Learning Director at IDE Mozambique, which is a development implementing organization. And you've done work in Mozambique, you've been in Rwanda working with the Sustainable Development Goals Center for Africa, you've done work in Nairobi with the East and Southern Africa Global Columbia Center for Africa. So I think your experience is quite wide. And what we're looking at now is with IDE's taken some of these sort of market systems resilience frameworks and developed something that's a bit of an index. Can you talk to us about what this index is? What are some of these determinants that you're looking at to understand market systems resilience?
Sure. So the Market Systems Resilience Index that we developed at IDE, it's an index or a measurement of resilience at a market systems level. It's a little bit one of its kind because for the first time, households and other market actors are put together and considered in the same market. The analytical framework that we used initially was the MSD from USAID, and we adapted it for further quantifying the index. So we have 11 determinants, like how redundant the market is, how integrated, how diverse, how many feedback loop mechanisms are, how much collaboration, enabling environment, so any determinants and indicators, particular indicators feed into those determinants so that we can then score and put a number into the determinants. We've done the MSRI in already 7 different countries for more than 5 years. So we already have data to compare across regions and across years. And it's been, there's so much potential for us to use the data in so many different ways.
I think it's really useful, and there is a handout on the Global System Resilience Index is one of the things that you've got, I believe, or there's a post over there if you want to take a picture afterwards. One of the interesting pieces that comes out of the Resilience Index, you mentioned, you've got this data that's comparative, and I know in our global market systems resilience community of practice, there's been some debate on, can you put a number to resilience in a community? Like, is that a helpful or is that actually hurtful? Because how can you actually say, well, there's this index, this determinant that's better in this community to that community? And it's so context specific. But I do think that it's really interesting when we were talking before this, and you were talking about, let's use Mozambique as an example, that you can actually say, you can look at market actors within a particular region, like you're working up north, which is more of an unstable conflict space. And now what you can do is look over time how something maybe in that community itself has changed, which I think offers a lot of opportunity to look at changes over time in specific areas. And you're also comparing south and north in a way. Do you want to say a little bit about what's coming out of that? I think you even said different practices between men and women as a comparison.
Yes. Well, because of the index, we have very interesting results. Households tend to be less resilient than other market actors. Resilience doesn't change that much across years, let's say the magnitude. We've seen in the north, as you were saying, that host communities are more resilient than IDPs, but then if you look a little bit more internally displaced people. But if you look a little bit more with a greater depth, you see that these IDPs are more resilient in determinants like collaboration, and exactly the same happens with women. Like women are less resilient with the index, and we need to understand that we're not saying that women are less resilient, but with that metric in particular of market systems, in disaggregating by females, they score less. But in determinants like of collaboration, they score more. So those are great insights for us to understand, okay, there are different subgroups of people that act and interact with the market in different ways. And those numbers, the idea is that shed some light for us on how we can shape interventions to build more resilience.
And it's really interesting. One of the things that we've been doing at the Vicara Institute is looking at the Market Systems Resilience Assessment Framework that Mike Field was speaking about, and that's the one I think also that you're referring to that we developed for USAID as a market systems resilient framework. And it looks at behavioral domains. And so those are things like how much cooperation is there between market actors, different types of market actors, what kind of competitive behaviors is there, and is there positive competition or negative competition? What kind of decision making is there, and is it based on evidence? Is it evidence-based decision making so that data is collected? What kind of business strategies are at play? So how are business strategies evolving, and are they more resilient in certain ways? And then we look at structural domains, such as connectivity, and you mentioned kind of that piece in terms of internally displaced people maybe showing more levels of connectivity, and connectivity at same actors within like the value chain and different actors within a value chain. And then also looking at diversity, and it was interesting, you mentioned redundancy. You know, often when we look at, you know, where there's greater redundancy, maybe there's more diversity. And diversity is a piece of that. The power dynamics, what kind of power dynamics, both formal and informal power dynamics exist. And then also rule of law, kind of not just policies and laws, but also the informal rule of law, what's driving, and those resilience pieces. And I think some of the comparative and the data you've got that can be drawn from is really extensive. I wanted to turn to Elizabeth, actually. And Elizabeth is with CARE, based in Ethiopia for the last few years. Elizabeth is heading the Livelihoods for Resilience program, a USAID program in Ethiopia. And before that has also worked with the World Bank as a livelihood specialist in Ethiopia, as well as in Washington, D.C., and has played various roles in development organizations based out of the States. So Elizabeth, you know, the program that you're doing is looking at livelihoods, it's looking at resilience. And I suppose the question is not just measurement, but what do you do with this? You know, what are some of the things you do as a result of understanding resilience? How do you work in this way? Are you working with the private sector? What are some principles driving that practice?
Thanks. Thanks, Margie. So I think one of our key challenges in a project like ours, which is working with very poor rural households within Ethiopia, is how do we work with market systems and strengthen market systems while keeping households at the center? So, you know, there's plenty we could do to strengthen certain market systems that would not benefit our households at all. And actually, in fact, at the beginning of the project, we had kind of a consultant come to provide some training, and you know, and he was, you know, kind of like, oh, you've got it all wrong. You need to wait for a lead firm to come and invest, you know, and you shouldn't be, you know, doing any of this work that you're doing, you know, let the market, you know, kind of do its thing. And we're like, I don't know if you know where we're working, but the private sector isn't rushing to invest in this specific districts where we're working and with the households that we're working with. So we're kind of trying to bring these two sides together. And one of the big things that we found that is also related to your point about fragile contexts is really the importance of the small local private sector. You know, these are, you know, small local entrepreneurs. Somebody was raising this issue before, but when we look at the conflict that just is kind of finally ending after 2 years in northern Ethiopia, we found the local private sector, the small scale agri-dealers, the small scale pullet growers who are raising the day-old chicks to, you know, the 45-day-old stage, you know, the small traders, they are the ones who stayed throughout the conflict period. They are the ones who the agri-dealers continued to supply inputs, sometimes kind of informally bringing things, you know, cross-border from another region. They kind of worked out working capital arrangements with other local business owners. They were determined to continue to supply inputs, to continue to supply services. You know, whereas you saw the larger private sector just, you know, couldn't, you know, in some cases just couldn't be operating, you know, formally and continuing at that time, kind of pulled out and is now looking to come back into northern Ethiopia. But during the conflict period, it was really the small local private sector that was operating. They're also more likely, I think, the small local private sector, again, more likely to see these poor rural clients that we work with as their poor households, as their client base. You know, there's always kind of this challenge of, you know, the smaller you get, the harder the business model becomes, but the more likely then they are to be serving, you know, the rural households that we're really trying to work with. I you know, kind of keep reminding ourselves that, you know, we don't believe in trickle down economics back at home, and I think we shouldn't be kind of trying to bring it overseas as well. You know, really investing as locally as possible, as opposed to kind of expecting some much higher level investments to trickle their way down and way out into these rural communities. maybe the other another approach that we found works very well to kind of link the households with these this private sector is working with vouchers. So you often have so you have this dichotomy often between kind of the market systems approaches over here, working with the private sector, and then you have the humanitarian actors over there because the big private sector isn't coming over here, so the humanitarian actors are distributing inputs, very critical, and we did some input distribution as well in the northern conflict. But where and whenever we could, we used voucher-based approaches, working with the local private sector. We were able to use.
And can I just ask, so
Yeah.
vouchers would be when you're maybe funding a voucher in the background, but
Yeah.
the voucher is being given, instead of giving resources to someone, they get a piece of paper, which means they can go to a firm or a local supplier and they can get something. So you're keeping the market system running, but you're
Exactly.
playing a behind the scenes role.
Exactly. So it's putting the sorry. It puts a subsidy, in the farmer's hand. They're getting access to a free input, anything from feed to pullets, again, these young chickens, vegetable seeds, tools, fertilizer. And then the private sector is, it keeps the private sector alive as well because they're getting the working capital from that. But the farmer then is getting an input for free. It keeps the private sector going as well. And yes, it's a piece of paper at this point, hopefully at some point in the future, digital, but we're talking about Ethiopia. It's coming. The digital, I think, revolution is coming, but for up until now, yeah, paper.
And I really appreciate what you've said in terms of not, we spoke in the previous session about not wanting to distort the market and not wanting to kind of look at what is we do, but work through the local private sector. And I think you've given some really practical examples. Luca, I'm going to circle back to you, and you'd spoken about coming back to this question about in fragile contexts, what are things that we need to look at and what do we need to consider when we're talking about resilience?
Okay, so what we are doing at the moment at FAO, we are trying to develop what we call a toolbox to assess value chain resilience in fragile contexts. No, so because there are 2 or 3 policy, we are developing in the sense that it will be ready in July. There are 2 or 3 key policy questions that we need to answer, because you start from the policy question, then you look at the tool and not the other way around. That is something that some of my colleagues in the econometrics don't understand. They start always with the number and then they look at the policy. So what are the key policy questions? One is the, and I'm coming from an organization that deals with food security, so is the food security as the outcome of interest. That is very important. So how whatever has to do with value chain contribute to food security. That is the first policy question. The second policy question is who are the actors along the value chain, and I've heard a lot of interesting things in the discussion of today about the role, and among these actors, who are the most vulnerable, that will be our interests. The third one is about transformation. A lot of the value, and I've heard again, a lot of the value chain that exists today is in 10 years from now, they might not be any more viable because many things, including climate and so on. So these are the sort of policy questions. Now, what we are looking at is essentially 4 or 5 key capacities, which from what I heard today, I think it's very much in line with what we are working on. First, we look at all the issues around financial aspect of value chain. So how a system works in terms of credit and access to a number of services. That's one. Another one is the adaptive capacity. So the capacity of any of the actor in the value chain to adapt through knowledge and so on. So that is the second one. The third one is environment. We work in fragile contexts where the system, in some cases, have almost reached the limit in terms of carrying capacity. So looking at the environment is, again, very important. Another thing I've heard today and is part of our tool is behavior. So what are the key priorities in the mind of any person in the category that we are looking about. And then the fifth one, because of course I forgot, but you give me a second, I will give you. Of course, market. I'm sorry. and the market characteristic, how it works. So but by looking at these 5, let's call it capacity, our aim is to develop an index that can be comparable from different contexts. At the same time, understanding also out of these 5 capacity, which one is the most important and where maybe, again, from a development point of view of an agency where, for instance, a donor could put his famous dollar. Yeah.
And I really appreciate what you said. I mean, even in terms of all of those areas, you're looking at that adaptive capacity.
Yeah.
You know, so much of what we're talking about is how can entities, enterprises adapt? How do communities overall adapt? And how do they then bounce back, but bounce back better, right? And be able to be more prepared next time. I think that's really, really helpful. And I'm wondering if I circle around to you, Lena, you're talking about this Market Systems Resilience Index and all the data you've got. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what are some of the results that have come out of this, using this index, that have maybe been quite interesting or maybe even a bit unexpected?
Sure, there's so many.
Great.
Okay, so the market in general is not inclusive. So let's say women and other systematically excluded groups don't participate in the market as men. Enabling environment, particularly in Mozambique, it's very low. Market actors, businesses complain a lot about either policies or interventions that are creating more barriers instead of letting the business grow. Preparedness as well, preparedness has not improved. In general, households are not more prepared to adapt or to deal with shocks. And shocks affect differently different types of factors. So, for example, COVID didn't affect at all households in rural Mozambique, but it did affect very heavily all the input suppliers or retailers. As opposed to households are heavily affected by climate change or cyclones and so on. And the capacity of recovery is also very different between market actors and by type of shock. So, for example, a household, it takes very long, or some that still have not recovered of a climatic shock and cyclone or a drought. As opposed to market actors that have a better capacity to recover a little bit faster. And that is maybe not that unexpected. Something that was very interesting for us to find out is some of the market actors that we have is input suppliers that, let's say, are the big guys that produce seeds and agricultural inputs, and the retailers that are the agro dealers, that the small guys that distribute that to the last mile. And we found that I think that in 1 year, the agro dealers were even more resilient than the input suppliers. And when we try to understand why, it was basically because these are the guys that are in the field, because they are the ones that know their client. They have feedback mechanisms in place to know, like, if your input didn't work, if the pesticide didn't work, or the seed didn't germinate, they have they can call them.
The relationships.
Exactly. Or we learned that they have some other strategies in, I don't know, ads in the radio saying the rains are going to come. It's good for you now to put your seeds. So we understood that these guys that are closer to their clients are more resilient and creating more resilience at a market system level. And that was very interesting for us to see. We even went to the input suppliers, the big ones. We showed them the results, and they were like, yeah, this is true. We don't collaborate between each other. We don't share information. And the other guys that come and buy things from us are actually the ones that are doing the work. So that was a very interesting.
And it's really interesting how that incentivizes investments of companies to invest down not just their supply chain, but also in their distribution chain. So even in the input supply distribution, so they've got that connection down at ground level.
And that touches a little bit on what Elizabeth is saying, is the role of these rural entrepreneurs in the market, in fragile or not fragile or impoverished communities. It's key, because they are the ones that know the communities, that are going to stay there after the project goes. So that role is key, and market systems development, like, you should try to facilitate those type of linkages, because they will stay.
And it's really interesting when you say that, because that leads to my next question with Elizabeth. I mean, I think I think several of the people who introduced yourselves in the beginning when we had some introductions in the room are working in kind of a donor space, implementing partner space as well. And we know, for example, larger donors like USAID and others are driving kind of a localization strategy. You know, there's work local, invest locally, but also a private sector engagement strategy where in that case it often means, you know, larger private sector. And you spoke a lot about the smaller scale private sector, which I think is so critical. Yeah. But is there a place for the larger private sector too?
Thanks. Yeah, definitely. This is one of the cases of the yes and situation. So I think one of them, linking the local private sector to the larger private sector is one of the most effective things that you can do. When you look at the work that we've done with agri-dealers in Ethiopia, and my colleague Rahel is here from SNV, a lot of it is, so there's a small kind of innovation fund, but a lot of it is really linking them to the bigger input suppliers, contacts that they didn't necessarily previously have. So linking, they're then the linkages between these rural communities where we work and these larger scale input suppliers, importing vegetable seeds, feed manufacturers, et cetera. Really critical. The larger private sector obviously has a lot more capital as well than the local private sector, so they're a key source of that, and that typically is, one of the big constraints of, the small local private sector. But I think, I think to me the key piece of it is that, when USAID works through market systems, the goal is often, the stated goal of USAID programming is at the household level, right? Household level impact, food security, nutrition, resilience. In order for it to accomplish that, the households really need to be the locus of, the household level resilience is what needs to be measured. The relationship of the households with that market system is what needs to be at the center of it. You can't just strengthen the market system and expect, again, the benefits to trickle down to those rural households who are in one way or another participating in it. So I think, Lena, what you mentioned about one big learning, the market systems are not inclusive. They're not going to be inclusive, and just strengthening the market system, even if our households are, supplying into it, is not going to benefit them unless we really structure the whole intervention around them. In our project, we had an opportunity at one point to work with a potato processing factory, and we looked at it kind of from every angle. They produce potato chips, kind of a big market within Ethiopia. They really wanted to source from our households. We couldn't find a way to do it that benefited the farmers. And they had prior experience of kind of working with groups that were then, side selling out of the contract. And, we looked at it again from different angles, and we said I can see why the private sector wants a sustainable supply. I can't see why those farmers that we work with in that area are going to benefit from this. And therefore, that's not something that we are going to invest in, because our objective isn't the potato value chain; it's the resilience of those households. So it's not, it's not to kind of, say nobody should be investing in that potato chain, but that's not our job, because that is not. We can't link that back to any household level impact. So I do think kind of making sure, maybe just can I say one more thing? Because Mike Fields was talking about kind of these pastoral resilience systems and this kind of the growth versus resilience mindset of the households. And I think kind of looking at what is the household's goal, because the household knows, they know if they have a resilience mindset or a risk mitigation mindset as opposed to a growth mindset, that's because they've lived, in a desert for many years. And, they're kind of probably making rational decisions there. But I remember years ago, talking with somebody from USAID, again, it was pastoral livestock marketing, and he was really saying, we need to make sure, that we need to tell those pastoralists they need to sell their livestock at 1.5 years, because that's really when, the meat is at its best, is at 1.5 years. And it was an end market analysis that we were doing, and I was like, but wait, isn't the goal pastoral resilience? Because all of a sudden it became like the tenderness of the steak that you're going to get from their livestock. So I think really but we forget about that. But I think making sure that we're going back to say, what is the impact at the household level? And is that really, are we centering everything on that as opposed to centering it on the market system or the value chain itself?
Right. Why are we doing this? And keep that at the center of the space. And I suppose the why also depends on what kind of actor we are representing and what our objective is. I know some of the people, when you introduced yourself in the beginning, and maybe some of the people watching online are coming from more of a financial services system space and an investment space. And I think, I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that space. One of the things that as Vicara Institute, we manage the annual Global Market System Symposium. It is taking place in Cape Town in November this year. In the middle of November when it's a lot warmer. And one of the tracks around that is around looking not just at market systems resilience, but also looking at it from a financial services system and investment and trade perspective. I won't speak to too much of that now, but I do think that some of you, I think, would connect well into that space. So I wanted to get just a sense from the room, questions or thoughts that are arising that we can speak to as we finish this session. So just anyone where there's maybe a question or an area that you want to talk more about. We have one over here. Jen.
Hi, thanks.
And again, if you can just say your name and then the institution that you represent.
Jen Abdella, Near East Foundation. Elizabeth, I thought your last point was really important and critical about keeping the goal in mind, both at the household versus the market, right? We care about people. And also about what it means, like what's the metric of success? Is it tender stake, or is it resilience, or is it something else? And we talked, one of the panelists on the plenary this morning was talking about who defines what resilience is. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you have, any of the panelists have integrated that locally defined resilience into your metric. So we have an idea of what it means, but local communities often sort of define success in their own way, and whether the metrics sort of pull that in.
That's helpful. Thank you. And Jen, a great question. I'm going to circle back to those, but let's get a few more from the audience.
Hey, this is Kai from Inter-Resilience Secretariat. We work a lot in kind of overseeing insurance and disaster risk finance implementation around the world. And Lina, I really liked the index that you presented, and I was wondering, like, what role does existence or even adoption of insurance play in that? And then on the other side of the coin, since it's my task to kind of track the impacts of the implementation that is done under the partnership, do you think it is or could become a tool also to measure impacts of insurance implementation on resilience? Because that's something where we are working a lot on, but we're still tapping in the dark in some corners.
Great. Excellent. So we'll come back to that piece around insurance as well. Very important piece, actually, in social safety nets, as well as private sector safety nets in terms of supporting resilience. So that question is a really key one in terms of the resilience discussion. Yes.
Yes. Hi, I'm Sagar from Mercy Corps. So my question is, how much rigorous, these analyses should be for, a program like the ones that, we are managing as USAID funded programs, or for anybody, like whoever is the audience, should we be making it much more simpler, or should we be making it much more rigorous? And what is how are we going to then, if it is more rigorous, how are we going to then, inform it? Because like those audiences would not be able to understand it, right? So that's the conundrum that I'm having.
Great.
Yeah.
Good. Great question. The rigor of analysis. There's another question here at the back. Our colleague from ESCOM, I think.
Hi, I'm Jose Correa from ESCOM. But the last panel and this panel, there seems to be an almost a battle between either growth or resilience. Makes me very uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't have to choose. So is the mindset in particular places that this is how I've always been resilient, and it's offsetting against the way the aid person, is describing growth? So what can we do to shift that? Because we don't want to keep that.
Thank you. Great question. Great comment. So, great comment. Any others coming up? Yeah.
Greetings to the panel. Daniel Deng from One Project. I'm interested, and maybe there's a shadow question to this that has to do with the big players and the small players, or but from the standpoint of what the evidence suggests, should we be working towards more or less integration of local markets into global markets from a resilience standpoint? And there's some other questions that could follow up around value chain and specialized kind of linkages between local markets and international markets. But really just that basic question, is it a good thing to integrate or not from a resilience standpoint?
Great, great. Unless there's anything, okay, let's start there. So, Lena, I think you wanted to talk a little bit about this question around, locally defined resilience, I think.
Yes, so let's say, so the MSRI is like a super
And
quantitative.
MSRI is your Market Systems Resilience Index.
Exactly.
Okay.
And actually, we brought some posters and we have some information so that if you are more interested, there's a QR there. It's a very quantitative measure. And because we know that numbers don't tell the full story, we have another qualitative part. In other countries, we've been implementing the MSRI with human-centered designed approaches and participatory approaches. And I also found very valuable the intervention in the beginning of the plenary, and I actually went to her and I was like, we went to the field and tried to understand what is resilience for the producers, for the women. Obviously, the term, they don't know what it is, so you have to be you have to explain what it is. And we got beautiful and very different answers. Like, for me, resilient is to not have revenge in my heart, or to very different things that are not in our interventions and we don't think about. So it's very important to come down to it, to make it a little bit more participatory. And then
Let's stop there. So that's on that question. So, sorry, I've got a microphone. And I think that, it's interesting when you're saying building in the qualitative. I think, for the Vicara Institute, our assessments are 100% qualitative. And I think it's exactly building on what you're saying, which is this being able to dig deeper and being so context specific. And probably with us, we probably never ask someone about what resilience is, but we'd speak to what are coping mechanisms, what are risk reduction strategies, and from that understanding what's important to communities. And it's interesting, a lot of other things that we don't expect often come out of that space. So I really relate to what you're speaking about there. There was also this question around, I'm going to move quickly to this rigor of analysis or assessment, because I think it kind of links a little bit to the last question. And I don't know if anyone wants to speak to, what is kind of, how rigorous should this be, or should it not be, or should this be kind of a mini instant rolling space? Are there any thoughts from the panel?
Thanks. I think one of the kind of opening remarks that Christine made about this, I think the third point about kind of using mixed methods to then, which then kind of help convince people. I think this was the meeting we had in DC last year. We were talking about how sometimes the best quantitative data is not what convinces people. And, some of us don't even understand it. If you start talking about standard deviations, I'm like, right, I knew what that meant. What was it again? So not to say it's not necessary, right? I think it is important, but I do think that the stories, and resilience especially, a lot of our measurement is proxies, right? It's proxies, which there are so many situations in which that doesn't work, and people's stories of resilience are different. And I think until you do, we're just now going and doing some really gathering stories of resilience from the northern conflict in Ethiopia. And, one person lost everything, but took one little, kind of input that she was given and turned it into an investment in an asset and is now regrowing her livelihood. Another person, lost almost everything except this one thing that she kept, and she used that to survive, and is, different, but if you take one, even all the metrics of resilience that we have and you try to apply it at a specific point in time, you may completely miss what resilience meant to that person. So I do think the role of the qualitative and the storytelling in particular, kind of tracking somebody's narrative over time, is really important. Not to say the quantitative isn't, and I think to the extent that we can combine the two, that would be my my preference, I would say.
Do you want to add to that, Luca?
Maybe I can say a couple of things on this. Yes, I agree. Most probably the word mixed methods is the best answer. At the same time, and I'm not saying that you have to be systematic. At the same time, in terms also of the famous, I don't like the word, but value for money and so on, a number of rigorous analysis for selected project is necessary, because this is for policymakers. Policymakers, they don't know about standard deviation. That's not the point. The policymaker have a couple of questions that are fundamental for them. If I invest in resilience, how much I save in terms of humanitarian assistance? So these are the kind of questions that the policymaker asks. And in order to prove the concept, then you have to have, because there is a community, that is the impact evaluation community, which is, they are ferocious people, that unless you are strong enough and robust, you will not pass the bar. So I think it's very important that sometime you do something that can be peer review, and not systematically, but on a selective basis. It's also important to stick also to something of the clear, rigorous rules of impact evaluation.
It's really interesting. And I'll give an example with the Vicara Institute. I mean, our Kenya study was over a 2-year period. And it was looking at, it was a really in-depth study, whereas the study that we've just done in Haiti took over 3 months, I think, or 2 months even. It was a very short study. And some of what we're working with is helping teams to, whether it's on a development program, to say, what are some of the critical domains within your space in that context that are key to track over time, because they're interrelated in some way. They're key, not, you don't have to do a big full study. You can just be keeping your eyes open and your ears open. What are behavior changes? What are you seeing? What are quick pieces? And then we also work with local private sector. Some private sector are so advanced in tracking these pieces, but others it's kind of new. What is useful for the private sector to track? And how can development actors use some of that data to start seeing changes? Really interesting. There was a question about the insurance piece. I didn't want to miss that part, and kind of insurance and as potentially a part of resilience. Alina, I think you wanted to speak to that.
Sure. So the index is composed by around 100 indicators, and they feed into the determinants. And in different determinants like enabling environment or integration, there are questions and indicators related with contracts and insurance. So yes, so now we have data on certain areas for different years. What is the relation of households with, do they have a long-term contract with an output market actor, or do they have access to agricultural insurance? So we do have data for that. And actually that is the point of, like right now, MSRI is a little bit like the metric, but the idea for it is to be an adaptive management tool that we first have a snapshot of the market system's resilience, but then we can dig into a more granular level and see, okay, this indicator of insurance, people in this area are not having insurance. Let's think about what can we do about that. And the idea is, like project managers and people to use the index to shape the interventions so that they can build more resilience. And I just want to touch base on the rigorous part, also for the MSRI. I guess rigorosity depends on what do you want it for, right? We have a fine line of, we still want it to be comparable across the years and across countries. So there are certain things that need to be standard and there's not much space to change. But that doesn't mean that we cannot localize things and make them appropriate to the context.
It's really helpful. And I'll say that the insurance piece for us is coming up more and more in our studies, and not just formal insurance, but also informal insurance systems. So we're both looking at insurance through private sector, but also informal insurance and social safety nets that are either public social safety net programs and support, and then also private sector components that actually provide social safety net, or safety nets rather. And so that's something we're building more and more into the framework and the assessments, because it's just such a critical piece of understanding and driving resilience. Yes.
Right. Yeah, thank you, Margie. And it's very interesting to hear, multiple times already today, that there's like increasing focus on informal insurance. And I think we have to move away from the understanding that insurance is only a product. Insurance really is a culture, and it's something that is already done by the people. So we got many informal risk-sharing mechanisms out there that people are already doing. And before we come and bring whatever insurance product that might have worked in an industrial country, we first need to understand how is the risk anticipated by the people, how do they currently manage, and how can we learn from that and improve maybe in kind of adding formal elements to informal insurance, that's really the way to go, I think, for insurance. And if I may, on the rigorous discussion, because I find that quite interesting, I think such a rigorous study should never be done for the sake of it, because it can never be done as a standalone exercise. We got 475 projects in the Intrasilence Global Partnership. If we do an RCT for each and every one of them, we run out of funds quite rapidly. So first you need to know what are the questions, and you need to be strategic about that and run an exercise, be it like an evidence gap map or whatever, to understand what is missing. And then you can strategically here and there run an RCT and systematically close down those gaps. Otherwise, it's they're too expensive to do it randomly.
Thank you. And we'd love to have you speak at the symposium, so please connect after this about some of those pieces. There was also a commentary around this question, and I think it's a little bit just a thought-provoking piece. There were two last sort of thought-provoking pieces we were left with. I'm going to tackle this one first, where you said, should there be more or less integration of local markets into global markets, and I don't think it's a right or wrong answer, but let's just hear if anyone wants to share a little bit on that context. Like, what about this integration of local? Should they be kind of looking and protecting own markets and operating within and using that as a safe space? Pandemic was a really interesting thing where sometimes borders closed, and what did that do? But then also the integration with global. Luca. Very difficult question.
I work for FAO, so we can you hear me? Yes. No. Two things happened in the last 3 years. No, we had COVID, and then we have the Ukraine war. No, and this on the one show that we are really living in an interdependent world. Something that happens somewhere then has an impact and so on. So one of the reaction that a lot of policymakers had is said, okay, we cannot depend anymore from international markets. We need to produce locally, invest in short value chain. So that is the reaction. Most probably, the answer is always you have to see the context. No, in some cases, this is the right answer. In other cases, particularly if this is backed by protection policy or something like this, might be counterproductive. No, so but I would say that what has happened in the last 3-4 years show us that most probably we should be very careful when we link local market to international market. So you have to look at the evidence and to see when is the case or not.
It's really interesting, Luca, when you say that. I mean, I think I appreciated your focus on context.
Yeah.
It's context. You've given us some really key examples, the pandemic and kind of the Ukraine crisis as part of that. I think when you look at some of the domains that we often look at for resilience, it tells a bit of a story. Where is there diversity? So are you too over-reliant in one place, in one market, in one supplier base, or whatever it might be? So if there's a lack of diversity that makes you less resilient, that's more the question than global versus local. There's a question around power dynamics. Where does the power dynamic lie? And where is the power concentrated and where is it exercised? And that's also, it's less of global versus local. It depends on, are you more or less resilient because of, or the structure of that whole system, because of where that power dynamic is. And if those were just two structural pieces I looked at, but behaviorally what came to mind when you're talking about that is, where's there the level of cooperation in amongst that system? Where's the kind of positive competition that's creating a healthy, competitive landscape for businesses to operate in? Is that being broken down, or is it actually health and making the system more resilient? Those seem to be key questions. And even that business strategy, we gave an example in the last piece, but to what extent are those business strategies innovative and able to be resilient so that if borders are closed, it can still work? And it's super interesting. I mean, another piece of work we do, which is around entrepreneurial ecosystems and understanding sort of developing innovation in business, is so many business models nowadays are not very border specific. You look at a lot of your shared whether it's shared cars or shared driving or shared clothing pieces or, ordering from Amazon across borders, suddenly that, we're not actually defining things by borders, although some policies might still protect those. I think that in 10 years' time, even 2 years' time, we're going to have very different kinds of conversations around this because of how business dynamics are changing, which is really interesting. Now, that brings us to another question, and I appreciate the challenge you've set to us. And you've said what you're hearing a lot is this growth versus resilience. And how do we get away from that piece? And I think back to the King of Spices conversation that we had in the previous panel, or those of you that were at the opening session earlier, where the conversation was never one or the other. It was to grow, to be growth orientated, we need to be resilient. It's kind of holding it together. Any thoughts from anyone? Yeah, or even open up thoughts from the room on this issue of why are we talking about one versus the other? Is there a place for that conversation in some of the work that some contexts that we operate in, or is that something we should move away from? Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I think so. I think the example that Mike Field provided earlier, and that I was also kind of reflecting on, is this very specific pastoral lowland context, which because to me
and Elizabeth, not everyone was in the room. Can you talk about that example briefly? And I could summarize it maybe. So what Mike was saying in that particular context is, for a growth mindset, maybe if you are a cattle breeder, then you want to sell all your healthiest cattle, right? Because that's what you're going to make the most money out of. But instead, what we're finding is that maybe in pastoralist regions, your healthiest cattle has kind of what Mike called a store of value. In other words, it is valued because you're actually thought of as wealthier. You're seen as more prominent in the community. It's a social safety net. You know what you sell? You sell your most sick cattle. You sell your weakest ones because they don't have as much value to you. So kind of a difference between, well, maybe we don't want to be pushing people, pastoralists, to be taking cattle, to be able to grow them in the market, to be very growth oriented in the market, because they want to use those cattle for a different purpose. It's more of a resiliency purpose. Whereas maybe they're now moving into goats and sheep or other crops, and that's more of their growth piece.
Yeah, thanks. And I agree. I think they're not necessarily, I think a lot of times they go hand in hand, right? Where you see, especially, for example, the household level, where you see growth, investment, those are then the households often that are going to be resilient. They've made different livelihoods investments, they have business experience, something may come, but they will then be able to bounce back, kind of building on that experience that they had. But I think it's, to me, where there is a little bit of a dichotomy is how do you consider risk, and how much risk is acceptable for the sake of growth? How much are you willing to risk something in order to grow? And I think some of the households that we work with, the poorest households have the lowest risk threshold. And so I think it's not necessarily our job to say, you should be growth oriented, come on. I think we can, we can inspire, we can advise, but where the preference really is for risk mitigation, I think kind of, again, getting back to what do farmers want? What are they looking for? And making sure that we're contributing to that and not kind of pushing our own agenda, if that makes sense.
And what's interesting that's coming out of this is the use of language, because I think when you're speaking, it's very much from the donor development programming perspective and understanding the needs and realities of different people. I think your question is coming outside of that space. And if you spoke to McCormick earlier as the example of the spice example, again, it's coming out of the private sector space. It's separate, and they're not separating that word. So the language becomes a key piece and is really interesting for us in this space. So yes.
Thanks. So specifically that example, maybe that example is specific, but just for that, and it's a conversation we had earlier. If what they're trying to do is to de-risk by holding on to cattle, and that is an ancient, centuries-old working system, but there are now other systems. We have insurance. Can we offer alternatives? Keep the resilience, move to growth as well? Is there a conversation to be had in that space that keeps them comfortable, but moves in a direction? I don't know what direction that would be. That's where I run out.
And
but
I think these are useful points. And often what we look at is change can only come from within. And I think that's important. And so part of it is looking at where are these sparks of change starting to happen. And sometimes that spark of change, for example, in this pastoralist community, could be in the move now to starting thinking about sheep and goats, shoats as they call it, are starting to think about that from a more commercial perspective, and the additional crops, because that could start, which could drive the rest being more commercial. But it's starting to create almost that safety net to be able to be less risk averse, which I think your point is really important. How do we not take anything as a given, but how do we start supporting from a background in a nurturing way that makes sense for the local context and makes sense for where the local context wants to move? There is so much more conversation we could have, and I think that we're excited to have another conversation in this track tomorrow. Very different speakers tomorrow with a lot of different experience. So I do encourage you to come to that conversation. There are a lot of different ways to connect into this globally too. I mean, I think, and a lot of these questions that were raised, we could have had an entire session on each of them. So thank you to the panelists, thank you to everyone online, and thank you to everyone in the room. So just to announce, there is a break now for 30 minutes, and then they'll be reconvening in the plenary, the main room at 4 o'clock. That's in 30 minutes time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Here's that.
Yeah, that's not an easy